Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, this is NATO 2020, a new podcast series pitching fresh ideas for the world's oldest military alliance. I'm your host, Terry Schultz, and I've been covering NATO a long time, so I know a lot about how the alliance has been doing things, but this series is about how it could be doing things differently. The Atlantic Council commissioned a series of 20 recommendations as to how the 70-year-old alliance could freshen up a bit heading into the next decade. Some of these ideas are things we've heard before, and some of them are brand new. All of them are aimed at helping NATO be more resilient and responsive to the threats that get more creative all the time. I'm going to be digging into all of these ideas with their authors. In this episode, the recommendation is Reimagining the Washington Treaty, NATO's founding treaty. The authors are Damon Wilson, the Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council, and Will O'Brien, the Executive Assistant to the Executive Vice President. Will and Damon, thanks for being with me.
Thank you, Terry. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay, so starting off, I just want to know what you mean by reimagining. So I want to know, does this mean that you are suggesting that the Washington Treaty be rewritten, or simply that it have some addenda, it just be fleshed out a bit, and then we'll get into exactly what you think should happen?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I can jump in on the first one. So I think you have already put a little bit more thought into this than we have, and I'd like to sort of clarify by saying we are by no means opponents of the Washington Treaty. We are big fans of sort of the brevity, the simplicity that allows the treaty to really drive the conversation in any direction and allow NATO to be adaptable and resilient. Our attempt at sort of reimagining is a vision for what the next 70 years look like, rooted in the history and tradition of the treaty and NATO itself as an institution. So there's technicalities of, do we have to vote through the Knack? Do we have to change how the structure of NATO works? And I think at the core of our argument is beyond that technical piece and more sort of setting a vision for the future of the alliance.
You're not saying do away with the Washington Treaty.
Oh, heck no.
No, by no means.
You're not suggesting we rewrite it. So let's look at
Terry, your dose of skepticism there. I'll just say Will's nailed it. That the point is to use this exercise. I mean, think about the difference between 1949 and today. Wow. I mean, it's pretty dramatic change. We've gone through just extraordinary changes in the global system. And so the core of this argument is really not to throw it out, to, as Will said, appreciate its simplicity, its elegance. I mean, NATO's adaptability is one of its strengths, but to really step back and take a moment to reimagine, what if you had to write the treaty today? What if we were all in the Mellon Auditorium today trying to come up with what a treaty for the free world, U.S. and North American and European democracies would do together? And give yourself some liberty, because we have an opportunity. We need to perhaps really think about how this alliance is going to operate and what it's going to look like in the future. So it's meant to be a fundamental exercise, a little bit fun, a little bit intellectual, but with real intent and purpose behind it.
Well, it has to be fun, or we wouldn't have you on our podcast series, Damon and Will. Okay, so that's one of the requirements of being here. And what's more fun than talking about NATO's founding treaty, really, when we get right down to it? So you have 4 overarching recommendations. I will read them so that you don't go into them in detail yet. Bolster NATO as an alliance of free democratic states. Ensure NATO can compete in an era of geoeconomics by protecting allies' economic security in the midst of rapid technological change and great power competition. Rebalance the transatlantic bargain and bolster NATO's role as the forum for political consultation to ensure common strategies, and put NATO at the center of a global network of democratic alliances and strategic partnerships. So these are your overarching themes for going back into the Washington Treaty, right? And you said that this reimagined NATO under the sort of fleshed out new treaty would position the alliance as the backbone of the free world. So as we start getting more into detail here, how does the original Washington Treaty not, at least in NATO's view, position it as the backbone of the free world? I think that's probably what it envisioned in the first place, wasn't it?
Well, look, maybe I'll take that first, Will. But look, in 1949, this alliance emerged in part out of fear that European democracies couldn't survive in the face of communism and Soviet expansionism. And so part of what we're saying is to bring this into modernity, bring this to today. The defining challenge that our allies are all facing is basically the challenge of autocracies and free societies. Can free societies thrive, protect their way of life, continue to expand, be an inspiration globally in a time when we've seen a democratic recession, we've seen the rise of China, of revanchist Russia, and the defining issue here is now autocracies versus free societies. And so part of this is going back to say, go back to the words that ring in the preamble, but didn't always play true during the Cold War, when NATO was tolerant of a military coup here or there. But how can we really position the alliance as being this backbone of the free world, backbone of free nations, when that's the great struggle that we see on this planet today?
And that's your first recommendation, at the basis of your first recommendation, to bolster NATO as an alliance of free democratic states. But that's not as innocent and simple as it sounds, because there are many debates inside NATO itself about how much you should even discuss allies' adherence to democratic principles at NATO. And that's something also that we'll talk about later in your recommendations, bringing in different debates to the alliance than sometimes take place there today. But in your recommendation, you say this would require allies to recommit to meeting democratic standards at home and to stand in solidarity in the face of authoritarian challenges to free peoples. Some of those allies have these exact challenges inside themselves. They're not talking about other countries, right?
I'll jump in and say some of those allies, including Damon and I, are both on the east coast of the U.S. right now. But the U.S. has to heal itself first, right? And a lot of these sort of recommitting to democratic values and principles, right now, the United States is the one that really needs the self-evaluation. And I think having allies hold folks accountable for those structures absolutely makes individual member countries stronger, but also strengthens the alliance and the values that it's based on.
It's sort of like setting an explicit North Star. I mean, we want to come, it's not actually to point out and, cause attacks on allies and turn them against each other. It's to come together and say, this is what brings us together, is that we are free societies. We have freedom for our nations. We have free societies. And that's the biggest challenge we see globally. Set it out as a North Star. It sort of resonates with the themes behind the Biden administration's rationale behind a summit of democracies, really elevating the place of democracy as a national security strategy.
But Damon, we talk about Turkey, or I should say, we being journalists ask about Turkey a lot, including at a time when the coup took place in Turkey, and officers of NATO were lured home and thrown in prison and accused of taking part in the coup. And there were a lot of questions there about whether Turkey was adhering to democratic principles. And NATO basically just didn't want to deal with it, didn't want to discuss it there. I mean, your recommendation would sort of throw that open and make that a valid discussion at NATO and required under this new suggestion, right?
Well, look, we're not proposing EU mechanisms to censor members and not expel members and all that kind of thing. We're trying to say, if you go back and reestablish first principles as we go through a strategic concept or a Washington Treaty rewrite, to put this at the center of it, so that we are saying that we are coming together because we represent free peoples, and free peoples that are going to be facing the challenge of authoritarianism. And so our democracies are not perfect, certainly in Turkey. We've seen here in the United States, as Will said. But to set that out as the North Star for the purpose of the alliance, I think it's an important principle to give oxygen to that concept, that that's what really binds us together. And then recognizes that in a country like Turkey, where there are imperfections, 4 of the top 5 cities are controlled by the opposition. There have been very tight elections back and forth. Are there some authoritarian tendencies in that country? Absolutely. We've seen this in a lot of countries throughout the alliance's history, and that's why I'm saying with Will that we want to put this out there as the North Star, that in a global landscape, if you're thinking about the environment we're in, you're going to have to be, it's a future of whether you're part of autocracies or free societies. And I think that's what's going to be the fundamental glue to keep us together in common action, is that we're going to want to be on the side of we represent free nations and free societies.
But in practice, how would that be different than now? Because I would say that's the North Star even now. That's the goal, that's the aspiration, and that's basically what each country acts like it follows. I mean, you've got Poland, you've got Hungary, you've got countries that are facing on their EU side, the other side of town, are being, are having infringement procedures against them for some of their anti-democratic practices, and yet then they drive across town to NATO and nobody says a word.
Look, this is sort of a renewal of vows, if you will. It's getting away from what happened, next Tuesday somewhere, to say this is a fundamental renewal of vows if we're going to reevaluate the Washington Treaty, where this was sort of captured as a way of life, but it had variability over the course of the Washington Treaty's history. And so what we're saying is part of a strategic concept or Washington Treaty rewrite, that you actually make this the explicit North Star in the bond, so that it becomes a vehicle of holding each other to account, people holding their governments to account, and holding accountability within the alliance. And so you're right, it's been in there, it's been part of it, but we've seen variations over the course of the history of the alliance. And in the context of a challenge that's quite different, a revanchist Russia in Europe, a rising authoritarian China in Asia, the future, the defining struggle we're going into is, are you part of the free world or part of autocracies? And I think if you talk to Poles, they have a pretty clear a view of where they're going to be, even if they have political polarization, vociferous debates on many of these issues. It's that recommitment to being part of the free world.
But if there's no accountability, how is that different from now?
This is part of going through this renewal of our vows. This is part of the concept behind a summit of democracies right now. We're not trying to build a bureaucratic institution to micromanage laws within countries. That's not what we're talking about at all. We're saying set out the clarity of a North Star, set out the principles and the values to stand very clear to them. It's an imperfect process, but it's how you actually be very clear about why we're in this club together and where we're going, and you're either on board with that or you're not. We're not talking about a whole EU structure and a mechanism to deal with these issues in that sense.
But in that case, if you're not, you're still in the club, because there's no way to hold you to account. But you think it will be enough to be inspiring, re-inspiring.
Look, again, I think you're sort of misunderstanding a little bit. It's repositioning this alliance as the spine of the free world, and are you committed in your commitment to this alliance and in the relationships and partnerships we forge? Are you part of understanding that we are free societies and that we're positioning this alliance really to be there in the face of the challenge from authoritarian and autocracies? Principally, that's Russia and China. And I think using that as a unifying purpose, so that it's a renewal of vows, that it does push us to actually be better. It does push renewal at home as the key themes that bring us together across our democracies. But we're doing this in the same camp together. Okay.
I hope it works, because those things exist in the original Washington Treaty as well, just perhaps not as enunciated as you're talking about making them. And you're right, maybe they need a renewal of vows. That's a good way to look at it. Let me move on to the second of your 4 overarching themes: ensuring NATO can compete in an era of geoeconomics by protecting allies' economic security in the midst of rapid technological change and great power competition. And you mention here China, which of course is now for the first time on the alliance's radar. I want to know more about this suggestion that you would develop the economic clause into a standalone article that binds them, meaning there's some accountability in a common strategy. So we're talking about, in this case, perhaps not being able to sell off key assets, which is a big concern of NATO and is handled again over on the European Union side. But tell me more about what a standalone article in your reimagined treaty would look like.
You want to go first, Will?
Yeah, so I would start by saying it's important to realize sort of the power of economics as a tool for democracies, free societies, security. Over most of the 70 years since the signing of the original Washington Treaty, democratic free societies have made their point by proving that they can bring prosperity and economic opportunity. What we've seen in the last few decades is that it is not something that we've cornered the market on at this point in time, right? Authoritarian societies, namely China, are growing their economies rapidly, faster than many democratic states, and sort of building into a security structure the idea that we're playing by the same common rules in the economic market, and geopolitics is inherently part of the new economic landscape for free societies, requires sort of a commitment from the core members and the allies within the alliance to make sure that we can continue to move forward and let democracy and free societies continue to be prosperous and playing in the economic sphere as part of the security portfolio.
But what would this article look like, and what would it hold allies to do?
Terry, and part of, again, this is less literal, like we're not being instructive about micromanaging tariffs. This is capturing the conceptual idea that the health and way of life of our societies, that we can no longer afford to handle security and national security and defense over here, trade, investment, economic policy over here. It's a recognition that this is fundamental, and that as democratic societies and allies, we need to engage in the geoeconomic competition in a way that is coming together with a coherent strategy among allies and democracies, and how you deal with the unfair practices we've seen coming from a communist China. The unfair practices of a corrupt Russia that has money sloshing through the Western system, or a China Communist Party that can manipulate companies in a way that they're competing against an unfair playing field against American or French companies in China. And so what we don't want is NATO to all of a sudden build the EU bureaucracy on trade, and not that. But it's binding the allies together to say, we are coming together to say we actually need democratic strategies. This is part of our security. This is how China is coming after us. And we're not going to have NATO micromanaging tariff levels. It's more of the idea that you're making a commitment in this renewal of vows, in the Washington Treaty, that the understanding that our economic security is intimately linked, and that we don't just say NATO does defense and foreign defense and security issues, and everybody else who knows nothing about it is over here doing their own, trade and tariffs and investment strategies. We've got to bring a more geostrategic, geoeconomic play to this issue.
Well, we have seen NATO making more of an effort to do that in saying things as the EU does, really warning allies not to be selling too much, selling national assets to the Chinese. But when you talk about the abuses of the Chinese and Russian money, the large amounts of money, these countries have sold off their assets, or are even still signing deals with China or Russia of their own free accord, and the United States has been pushing them not to do so with China in particular, especially under the Trump administration. Secretary Pompeo was extremely fierce about this, and yet it hasn't really convinced many European governments, European allies, to turn away from China completely. So How would you do that? How would you change their strategic thinking to make them understand that this can also pose a geostrategic risk in the long term? They know this. They know this already.
Yeah, you want to go, Will?
I think you're going to love the third point, Terry. I think when we get to political consultation and the power of sort of working together on issues that aren't inherent to the alliance and sort of building common strategy, working through common problems as a group that is sort of powerful in the transatlantic space, but also sort of influential on a global scale, that sort of bringing in political consultation to work through these issues that at the moment, NATO is sort of uncomfortable talking about economics and the reaction to China in the setting of the alliance. And sort of, I think when we get to point 3, you will be equally skeptical, but hopefully sort of more pleased by how we've thought through this.
Well, you guys aren't here to make me happy. I'm just trying to, parse it out. But I do still.
We always like to make you happy, too.
Let Damon fight. Let Damon fight this point too, still, because this is something that is ongoing and has been very frustrating for the United States in particular.
Look, Terry. I mean, look. The answer is not just to tell your allies to stop trading with China. I mean, that's frankly insulting, dumb, and not viable. And so, a little bit of this is a recognition that we're in this boat together. We got to figure this out together. So, for example, rather than getting everybody concerned about the supply chain dependencies on China and that we're going to do everything's going to be reshored to national reshoring, well, that's not exactly that smart if you think about it in the context of across the alliance, because it just looks very different in Luxembourg than it does if you're in the United States. But if you came together and said, we actually need to...
Even more importantly, in Berlin.
Well, no, but the point is to...
Berlin is the one everybody worries about.
No, but my point, you're missing the point, is to say we're trying to build, for example, democratic reshoring. We realize that we can't be dependent on China for certain supplies. So it's not going to be just buy America or all that kind of thing. But we're sitting here consulting and trying to say we're in this boat together. We've got a real challenge. How do we get this right? It doesn't mean cutting off trade and investment with China. It means that as allies, we are going to develop a common democratic strategy and approach to these types of things. We recognize that these are sort of things that we need to be bonded to and commit to as part of it. It's the meaning of an alliance. The alliance doesn't need to operationalize it. They don't need all that expertise to operationalize it, but it does need to permeate the concept in this 21st century era of geoeconomic competition. The concept of an ally, democratic allies, means that that's the kind of thing we would be making the point of building a common strategy, developing an approach to democratic reshoring on certain assets rather than just buy America or buy Luxembourg or buy Germany. And that's a little bit of the concept that we're driving forward.
Well, considering that China has only been mentioned for the first time within the last, 18 months, I mean, there seems to, in this case, there could be a lot of room to develop what you're talking about. So, yeah, I mean, that I would suppose there's a lot of room for that, even though, again, on the EU side, and you do specifically mention more NATO-EU cooperation on this issue in particular, that conversation has been going on longer.
I mean, just Terry,
but when we move to...
Terry, if you back up for a second and look at the news, I mean, you'll see for so many years, you would see like...
If I look at the news?
Well, no, exactly. But the trade debates would be about the US and EU fighting over bananas and fighting over, like, it's ridiculous. We are in a struggle for the free world and China's eating our lunch. And so we're slowly moving in this direction to reframe that, to say, competition's a real thing. I mean, South Carolina competes with North Carolina. We get it. But we're in this together. China's eating our lunch. We need a more coherent approach as allies to this geoeconomic competition. And that's the thrust we're driving for.
Okay, so as Will says, that leads into point 3, that you would start having these conversations more at NATO, whereas they used to be sort of pushed aside and considered that there were other places to have those conversations. Do you think something that NATO is going to be open to? Because, I mean, it has enough on its plate, doesn't it? Does it really want to be having these conversations?
So it's someone who used to sit behind the Secretary General and others at the Knack table for a lot. The point here is not to overload NATO's agenda of what it has to own and do. In fact, quite to the opposite. I don't think we think that NATO should be building a vast bureaucracy to sort of outmaneuver the EU. That's stupid. That's not the point. The point is that we need a common space to forge common understandings on the defining challenges of our time that are broader than defense and security, that involve foreign policy, that involve international economics, and to use this forum of the Knack with the EU at the table as really a forum to debate and discuss some of the big issues. Not the thing I want to try to break is that when the Knack talks about an issue, it shouldn't mean that the NATO bureaucracy goes into action. It's the idea, the original idea of why the Knack was created, is to have it as a forum for this political consultation.
That was something interesting I noted in your paper, that people need to stop thinking that if you bring it up, there has to be a NATO solution for it, a NATO application for it, and therefore if there's not, you don't talk about it, right?
I think you have to break that taboo. People get nervous about raising an issue at the Knack because it signals NATO is going to launch a military operation. Well, that's ridiculous. The point is, it's the framework alliance for the free world, and so we better sure as hell have a venue in which we're consulting, we're figuring out how to do things. It's the idea in a more balanced, a more equal partnership where Europe is going to do more, that you really do have to consult, and you don't just do it bilaterally. Of course, that happens. But you really do need to consult and figure out, mope through this and figure out how do we really deal with these types of issues. And so using the vehicle of an alliance, don't be trapped by NATO headquarters. Don't just think about NATO headquarters. Think about the concept of an alliance as that we're committing to each other to develop common approaches, common strategies where we can on the big issues out there.
Isn't that why you have the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe? Just kidding. Over there, you even have Russia. It's such an agile organization. No, but you're talking about opening it up to issues that would otherwise be handled normally by other organizations as well. I mean, that makes sense since they are increasingly interlinked, right?
They're not handled by other organizations. They're usually like Americans talking to the Germans and talking to the Brits, talking to we don't have a structured way. I mean, think about what you do at the end when you're in the U.S. government. You're managing an interagency process to help develop concepts and policies on big issues that bring together all the agencies. Extrapolate that to the alliance. Use the alliance. Use NATO to help actually bring disparate actors on board as you think about some of the big issues. How do we develop common strategies and approaches to these big global challenges?
Okay, and this would be handled in the NACs, or you said also in here that you would sort of have smaller alliances within the alliance. But that's moving into point 4. Sorry. We can go ahead and transition to that because that sort of follows on from what you're saying, that there would be other small networks inside NATO that would sort of be handling these kind of issues more specifically?
So I think it's a good transition point to the fourth point about sort of the center of a network of global alliances. I think when the original treaty was written, we've gone back to this 1949 sort of time frame quite a few times here. There was a single threat, right? It is a Cold War institution. You can sort of guess by hair color which one of the authors of this piece was not born during the Cold War, and sort of the need to.
That's so mean, isn't it?
It's his value. It's his value.
The need to rethink for a new generation and sort of bring in a voice where, to get back to your point, there's sort of this younger voice doesn't see a singular threat of the Cold War mentality as the driving force behind NATO. So alliances are going to change and grow. That doesn't mean everybody needs to be part of NATO. That doesn't mean every NATO ally needs to handle all issues. One of the pieces we potentially could wrestle with is, what does it look like for a democratic Russia of the future to become a NATO sort of ally with the alliance, not necessarily a member of the alliance itself, but sort of how do we set up a formal relationship with a democratic Russia in sort of the post-Vladimir Putin age? What does it look
Well,
like?
back before you were born, Will, that used to be mentioned here and there by those of us covering the alliance at the time.
I'll have to read about it.
Read our footnotes.
But but I think to get to your point, it's less about sort of internal networks of alliances within member states, and more about how does NATO look outward? How does in the future we could imagine sort of partnerships with North Africa, right? Are there governments in Morocco, a future Egypt, a future Tunisia, that we could go out and say, the Mediterranean is important to the security of the transatlantic space, and we would like to partner with you as an alliance to make sure that transatlantic security includes the South Med. Do we work with Latin America? Do we work with East Eurasia and sort of moving across and sort of not bringing everybody into NATO, right? We don't want to water down the power of the alliance by saying there are 180 countries in NATO now. It's not trying to become the UN. But how do we really say you could work with us? And this was, I think, where we get the imagery of spine of the free world, and sort of the spine is holding up this structure, but we have lots and lots of different pieces that need to be linked into that alliance network in order to create sort of global stability and prosperity.
Anybody who's reading all of the initiatives in this series will have plenty of ideas about that. Just to promote it.
Well, it does pick up on some of the things.
But
it does pick up on some of the.
But Damon, talk more about that. How would that work? Because when you start talking like this, it sounds unwieldy, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's really quite simple. I mean, we're saying leave Article 10 intact. So, you could have Georgia, Ukraine join. You could have other Balkan.
Hold on, I'm going back to Article 10.
Yeah, it's the enlargement one, but it's
the enlargement treaty. Got it. Yep.
Yeah, so you got them in. So that remains intact. What we're saying is that you actually need a new way of conceiving of it. You can have an alliance with the alliance, and you're absolutely right, Terry. This does build on ideas that we've heard from President Clinton, President Bush, and talking about Russia. That could you imagine not being an ally, but an alliance with the alliance? That was an idea debated in the early days about Russia. Obviously, the way Vladimir Putin took the Kremlin, that's not happening. But maybe in the future, there should be a vehicle as an alliance with the alliance. And you could imagine that, frankly, today with Japan and Australia as part of democratic relationships. You could imagine that with the European Union in a really interesting way, so that the EU isn't exactly a member, but there's an alliance and it becomes part of those deliberations. That one's a little bit different than I'd say Japan and Australia. But it creates this mechanism that puts NATO at the center of this network of democratic alliances. And I think that's the point.
So we're coming sort of to the end of our usual time period now, but to sort of wrap this up and to put it back in at the beginning, are you actually considering that, as you said, a new strategic concept is in the works anyway? Would you say that you actually need a new treaty, or that you just need to talk about the old treaty more and talk about how it can be like you say, enlivened? I mean, do you think NATO would go for a new treaty? It sort of likes to rest on tradition, and nobody's talking about changing the U.S. Constitution or anything that was written by the founding fathers. So why would NATO have to change its founding document?
Well, so 2 points. I would say we have amended the Constitution.
You've amended it, but you didn't replace it.
We didn't replace it, but we've changed large portions of it. And I think that is, no legal scholar is arguing that amendments are a bad thing when constitutionality catches up with modernity. The other piece, to sort of get back to the core of your question, that was your first question and your last question, is no, you shouldn't start with rewriting the treaty as the first step. Rewriting the treaty should come after political consultation, agreement, working through issues with allies, so that you can then sit down in agreement and say, what do we want to be as an institution? You shouldn't open the treaty and sort of let anybody start hanging things on it like a Christmas tree. You need to make sure that you're all on the same page first, and then think about, once we're in agreement, once we know what we want the next 70 years of our alliance to look like, how do we formalize this? How do we build this into our institution?
But isn't that why they rewrite the strategic concept every decade or so? I mean, why isn't this just a new strategic concept? And why are you talking about rewriting the treaty?
And Terry, to be fair, look, we love the Washington Treaty. We would never advocate opening it up frivolously or getting rid or rewriting it. No. What we are talking about, we want to use this as a bit of a provocative exercise to reimagine if you had to adapt the treaty to what it is today, because it's a disciplining argument to say, if we needed to step back and think, what do we need today? What should it do? It's going to lead you to the conclusion, well, maybe we don't just need enlargement for European states. Maybe we do need to think about how we have alliances with alliances. Now, do you need to revise the Washington Treaty to do that? Maybe not, maybe not. But the whole point is to use that mental exercise, albeit a little bit provocative, to really push ourselves to think about what we need to do as a free world that is under assault, that has seen authoritarians roll back freedom globally. What do we need to do to actually stop that, reverse that, and how do we use this beautiful instrument of the alliance to help achieve those ends? And so, this would have been mayhem to open up under the Trump administration. As Will said, you don't do this unless you actually have commonality of vision, commonality of approach, and then let's reflect what that could be. And yes, this could absolutely take place in the context of a new strategic concept. I think we're trying to push the level of ambition, the level of creativity. This is a moment where NATO's thrive because of its adaptation. But we do think this is a moment where bold ideas and some bold movement are required, and it's not just a linear extension of the past. And so we embrace this kind of idea to be a little bit more provocative, to raise the level of ambition, to think about what we need today to be effective.
It's provocative in some ways that NATO isn't comfortable doing, and that would require looking in the mirror, your recommendations, because they have not been willing to look at allies themselves and say that they're not behaving in such a democratic way. You cannot get a statement like that out of the Secretary General, because I have tried and tried and tried and tried. So would that require...
Yep, I'm not asking for that. This is your strict constitutional literal interpretation, and that's not how I would approach it.
But you do say that they would need to put more effort into being democratic, into adhering to democratic values. And,
absolutely, we're talking.
And so that's your first point.
It's a strict interpretation but I hear you.
Come on, I'm a journalist. I need to get some headlines out of it, and something to hold them to. But I mean, is NATO, so to wrap up, would NATO be ready to do this? A lot of our recommendations in this series aren't necessarily something NATO would be ready to do, but I mean, I like to know how much of a possibility it is. And NATO, better than anyone I know, Damon, or as well as anyone I know at least. I mean, is this something that you could see the alliance doing?
Again, so the alliance is an expression of its members and its allies. And sort of what we're doing with this whole series is a little bit of banging the pots, a little bit of a wake-up call that we're on our back foot. We've seen the erosion of democracy globally, and we've seen populism at home erode our commitment to some of the underlying values. And if we're not careful, we're going to see that erosion at home lead to an increasingly world in which freedom is squeezed globally. And that's going to be devastating for our security interests, our values, and our economic interests. And so that's what we're really trying to drive home. We have got to think as the allies, and this isn't a NATO decision in Brussels. The capitals really have to understand we are in a moment here. How do we come together, renew our vows to ensure that free nations and free societies are going to be the source of inspiration, going to be the source of prosperity and the source of security for our people going forward. And so that's what we're pushing at, a little bit trying to understand what's at stake here. And we don't just need to talk, NATO needs to do a little bit more cybersecurity or a little bit more this and that. We are facing a systemic challenge with the continuing rise of an authoritarian power. And we want this alliance to be fit for purpose to ensuring that the cause of freedom is anchored firmly on this planet. And so it's pushing that level of ambition, as we know with the new administration, as you go into a new strategic concept. Putting these issues on the table is fair game, But NATO becomes the vehicle through which we're achieving big strategy. And so it has to be Americans with a strategic purpose wanting to do this. Germans thinking strategically about how to use the alliance to these ends. And I think that's what we're fundamentally pushing for. Our democracies as allies need to forge a more ambitious common strategy for the 21st century.
Well, there's certainly, if there's going to be a window for it, it's right now with President Biden, and everybody looking forward to his administration. And from everything I've heard from the allies so far, they're already extremely happy with the level of consultations and the way things are going. And things could very well be imaginable now that would not have been certainly 4 years ago, maybe even in any previous administration that got along better with NATO. So it's a good time to look at ideas like the ones we have in our series. So that is going to wrap up this episode on reimagining the Washington Treaty. Thank you so much, Damon Wilson and Will O'Brien, for sharing your ideas here. And to our audience, you can find all 20 ideas on atlanticcouncil.org, and tell us what you think on Twitter at #StrongerWithAllies. And I'll see you next time.
Thank you, Terry.